A jaw-dropping climactic reveal can help elevate a movie from good to great, leaving audiences shocked at just how effectively it pulled the wool right over their eyes, and teeing up plot twists that they never saw coming. And the most satisfying twists are generally those which the movie actually gives viewers a solid chance of guessing. Of course, your chances of noticing them, let alone putting 2 and 2 together on a first viewing, are pretty damn close to nil, but they certainly make for a satisfying realization upon repeat visits. So let's take a look at them today. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are movie reveals that you can spot early if you really look. Kaiser Soze's real identity, the usual suspects. The mythical, shadowy gangster known as Kaiser Soze is revealed to be none other than Verbal Kint, who has been improvising a story to US Customs agent Dave for the entirety of the movie. Now, to be fair, spotting it early in this case is only about 30 seconds before the pin drops, but nevertheless, if you keep your eyes peeled during the revelatory montage, you can see Keaton being fatally gunned down by Kint. The shot is low lit and extremely fleeting, but Spacey's face is clearly in the frame for a few fractions of a second, and if you are sharp enough to notice it or quick enough to mash the pause button at the right moment, you'd know before everyone else that Kint is Soze. It's a secret prequel, Final Destination 5. The fifth Final Destination film's genuinely surprising twist is that it's actually a prequel to the original movie. The final scene dovetails quite excellently into it, as the surviving characters are killed in the very same flight from the first film. In a feat of subtlety that nobody would have expected from the Final Destination franchise, the fifth movie does a fantastic job subtly keeping any obvious tells out of the picture, by not focusing too much on, say, pop culture of the period. But there is one ingenious giveaway. The obnoxious character of Isaac is seen using a flip phone, a type of mobile phone that was enormously popular in the late 90s and early 2000s when the first film was set. The flip phone had died out a few years before Final Destination 5's 2011 release, having been rendered obsolete by the smartphone revolution, which serves as an easy, cheeky indication that some timeline shuffling shenanigans are afoot. Georgina is Dean's mother. Get out. The Armitage family's dark secret is that they transplant their elderly family members' brains into the bodies of the young, fit, and healthy black people that they kidnap. As such, the various black employees on the property are actually possessed by old white people, such as housekeeper Georgina being under the control of Rose's grandmother. And here's how you spot it early. Writer-director Jordan Peele does a fantastic job sowing hints to the movie's true narrative throughout, though drops the most obvious, least abstract visual nod to the big reveal near the start of the movie. When Dean Armitage is showing Chris around his house, he enters the kitchen and tells him, "My mother loved her kitchen, so we keep a piece of her in here." Just then, Peele focuses his camera solely on Georgina for a pregnant moment, and to anyone paying sufficient attention, the combination of dialogue and loaded glance provide an overt hint at what's to come. Tyler Durden doesn't exist. Fight Club. Ultra-cool anarchist Tyler Durden doesn't actually exist, but is an invented alternate personality residing within the mind of the insomnia adult protagonist. And here's how you spot it early. David Fincher's masterful thriller is rife with clever visual nods to its eventual big reveal, but nothing more ingeniously simple as a piece of text on a payphone. After the protagonist's apartment is blown to smithereens and Tyler calls him from a payphone early on, Fincher shows a close-up of this phone, above which a line of bolded text reads, "No incoming calls allowed." This confirms that there was no physical way for Tyler to call Norton's character using that payphone, which makes it decidedly easier for audiences to piece together that Tyler doesn't actually exist at all. It's kind of brilliant, isn't it? Sammy Jankis' story is actually Leonard's. Memento. So Leonard ended up causing the death of his wife himself due to administering her an accidental insulin overdose. And so the story that he tells of his fellow amnesiac Sammy Jankis, who killed his wife that very same way, is actually his own. And there's an extremely blatant yet nevertheless easily missed hint during one of the black and white flashback sequences where Leonard is telling Sammy's story, where it becomes easy to spot this big reveal. For just a few fractions of a second, we see Leonard appearing in the scene in place of Sammy, making it abundantly clear to anyone paying close attention that Sammy's story is in fact Leonard's. Mr. Orange is the rat. Reservoir Dogs. So Mr. Orange is actually an undercover cop named Freddy, who partakes in the jewelry heist in an attempt to bring down crime boss Joe Cabot. And there's a deliciously subtle hint to Orange's true motives in the movie's opening diner scene, where Cabot returns to the table and finds that one of them didn't contribute to the tip. Upon asking, Orange immediately rats on Mr. Pink, without even a second thought. And when Cabot asks follow-up questions, Orange is quick to respond each time. Quick enough, in fact, that Cabot even tells him to shut up. It draws an immediate line between Orange and the rest of the gang, given that a real criminal would never likely grass up their fellow man, especially for something as innocuous as a tip. It's raining frogs, Magnolia. The climax of Paul Thomas Anderson's epic ensemble thriller involves the most unexpected sight, a near-biblical rain of frogs from the sky. Anderson's film is absolutely filled with visual foreshadowing to this eventuality, given the abundance on the numbers 8 and 2 throughout the film, referring to the Bible passage Exodus 8:2, which reads, "But if you refuse to let my people go, I will plague your whole country with frogs." Though viewers would be forgiven for not reading too much into an early weather report title card which states 82% chance of rain, the number appears more than 20 times throughout the film. Some of the more overt examples include the rope on the roof where Sydney jumps off resembles the number 82, the American Association of Forensic Science dinner starts at 8:20 p.m, and Exodus 8:2 itself is shown on an audience sign during Jimmy Gator's show, as well as on a bus stop and also a billboard. Separately, these references might not seem like much, but their sheer pervasive, cumulative presence just might seep into your unconscious. Robert caused Margo's disappearance. Searching. So the party responsible for Margo's disappearance is actually Robert Vick, the son of Detective Rosemary Vick. And shortly after Margo's disappearance, her father searches through his late wife's computer, specifically her address book, looking for clues. One of the first entries he fleetingly glances at is for one of Margo's classmates, Robbie Albert, with the notes field explaining that he has a parent in the police force and that his parents are divorced and that he's got a crush on Margo. There is admittedly some clever deception at play here. Robert is referred to by his nickname Robbie, and his surname is that of his father, because his mother goes by her maiden name of Vic. Still, the film plays fair enough to mention the divorce in the address book. But the two clues really worth paying attention to are his crush on Margo, which is an immediate attention grabber given that it's noted in the book at all, and the fact that one of his parents is a cop. Though you'd certainly need impressive powers of deduction to figure this one out right away, it nevertheless gives attentive viewers the inside track on unraveling the central mystery. Amy framed Nick. Gone Girl. So the reveal of this film is that apparent kidnapping victim Amy actually faked her own disappearance in order to frame her husband Nick for his extramarital affair. And here's how you spot it early. So early in the film, we catch a brief glimpse of Amy writing in her diary, which is later used as evidence to suggest that Nick is an abusive husband and that Amy is becoming increasingly fearful for her life. We of course eventually learn that the diary was actually fabricated by Amy to implicate Nick, but in this early shot, there's a fleeting dead giveaway. As Amy writes in her diary, several pens with their lids removed are seen at the top of the frame above the diary, because of course Amy switched between different coloured pens while faking the diary to make it seem more believable as a detailed account of her abuse over time. If every entry was written in the same pen, it might attract suspicion. Genius, right? Parcher isn't real. A beautiful mind. So the reveal in this film was that United States Department of Defense agent William Parcher doesn't actually exist. Instead, he's a figment of John Nash's imagination as he struggles with schizophrenia. And here's how you spot it. At the 32-minute mark, Nash leaves the MIT building, and director Ron Howard seemingly makes a point to linger on the fact that the building's door takes around 8 seconds to slowly close on its own. The camera then moves away from the door just as Parcher, who is out of shot, shouts to John. But when we pan back to the door frame where Parcher is now standing, the door has closed just 3 seconds after the camera moved away from the door, which, as we've just known, would be impossible. Furthermore, if you listen closely, Parcher actually shouts Nash's name while the camera is still moving away from the doors initially, which again would be physically impossible without Parcher having powers of teleportation. Now, these tricks are unconscious enough to be easily missed, but if you do notice them, they immediately tell you that something is majorly off with this character. Chuck isn't really a cop. Shutter Island. Now, though most people actually guessed Shutter Island's biggest twist, that Teddy Daniels was himself a patient of the hospital, far less viewers twigged the fact that Daniels' fellow US Marshal Chuck also wasn't who we thought. In fact, Chuck was actually Daniels' doctor, Lester, who posed as Chuck as part of an elaborate exercise to try and break his conspiracy-filled delusions. And here's how you spot it early. There's a brilliant giveaway right in the first few minutes of the film as Daniels and Chuck are arriving at Shutter Island, and Deputy Warden McPherson asks them to surrender their weapons. They do so, but for a few seconds we see Chuck struggling to unholster his gun, because of course the guy isn't really a cop at all. Hilariously, there's even a fleeting shot where McPherson seems exasperated with him, which on a first viewing seems simply like just general frustration, but it's more likely his irritation at having to play along with this charade. Though there are many clues threaded threaded throughout the film to hint at Teddy's frayed sanity, this is the only major hint that Chuck also isn't who he says he is. Dalton is still inside the bank. Inside man. So after the initial bank robbery appears to be over and criminal mastermind Dalton Russell has seemingly disappeared into the night, he then reveals the real heist. In fact, he remains hidden behind a false wall within the bank for an additional week, after which he calmly makes an exit with the loot in tow. And here's how you spot it early. Aside from the fact that the movie title itself is a rather playful hint at the twist to come, the reveal is actually much more blatantly spelled out during the opening credits sequence, where the decal on the side of the criminal's fake van reads, "Perfectly planned painting. We never leave until the job is done." Stopping short of literally telling us that Russell ends up hiding within the bank walls, this pretty clearly lays out the nature of the perfect robbery that he brags about in the film's opening monologue. Pretty clever, right? Adelaide isn't Adelaide. Us. Now, Us's climactic film twist is that protagonist Adelaide isn't actually the real Adelaide at all, but rather the tethered doppelganger who swapped with her real counterpart when they were both children. And so who we thought was the tethered villainous Adelaide all along was the real version who was attacked by her tethered equivalent, and then had her throat crushed, preventing her from speaking out, and was left underground while the doppelganger took her place. Now, this is obvious enough that some fans actually guessed it from the trailer alone, though it was still largely missed by most audiences. In an establishing shot as Adelaide and her family are setting off on their vacation, Adelaide snaps her fingers along to "I Got 5 on It," which is being played on the radio. But something is immediately off. Adelaide bizarrely snaps her fingers on the odd-numbered beats rather than the even-numbered ones, as you'd expect anyone with a basic sense of rhythm to do. And considering that Adelaide is quickly established to have been a dancer as a child, it becomes even more suspicious, foreshadowing that she really isn't who she appears to be. Kevin Bacon was dead the entire time. R.I.P.D. Though R.I.P.D. came and went without making much of a dent, it did boast one genuinely surprising twist. The plot is set in motion when cop protagonist Nick is murdered by corrupt fellow officer Bobby Hayes. And while it's not terribly surprising that Hayes is revealed to be in league with the Deados, the human spirits who refuse to move on to the afterlife, there is actually a more surprising twist lying in wait, as it's eventually revealed that Hayes is actually a Deado himself, having been killed by a junkie on a prior mission. But you know what? This is actually laid out with hilarious obviousness in retrospect. During the opening raid in which Hayes kills Walker, the cops are all lined up outside the building, and only Hayes isn't wearing a bulletproof vest. Why? Because he's dead, of course, and he actually doesn't need one. Emile is Scrappy-Doo. Scooby-Doo. The villainous Emile Mondavarius, played by Rowan Atkinson, isn't the real villain at all in this rather amusing Scooby-Doo live-action film, because he's actually a robot being controlled from within by Scooby-Doo's obnoxious nephew, Scrappy-Doo. Even with Scooby-Doo's history of villainous disguises, who the hell saw this one coming? Well, you can actually spot it early, because there are numerous tells throughout the film, namely moments where Emile is shown behaving to be like a dog, such as scratching behind his ear, baring his teeth, growling, and so on. Though audiences will most likely dismiss this as just Rowan Atkinson's typical silly mugging, in actuality, these flourishes make it clear that there's much more to him than meets the eye. Einhorn is Finkel, Ace Ventura pet detective. So at the end of this film, we find out that Lieutenant Lois Einhorn is a trans woman who was formerly a male football player by the name of Ray Finkel, and is ultimately behind the plot to steal the Miami Dolphins' prized dolphin mascot, Snowflake. And there are actually several distinct hints to Einhorn's previous identity. For starters, when Ace first meets her, he loudly quips, "Holy Testicle Tuesday," while looking directly down at her crotch area. Secondly, when Ace is in Einhorn's office, 2 apples and a banana are strategically arranged on her office desk to resemble male genitalia. And when Einhorn straddles Ace moments later, he tells her, "Your gun digging into my hip? Do you get it yet?" This, of course, completely flew over the heads of many watching the film back in 1994, but in retrospect, it's really quite obvious. Emily has a twin sister. A simple favor. So the corpse that was found drowned in the lake isn't actually Emily at the end of this film, but it was her twin sister Faith, who Emily murdered after she attempted to blackmail her. And if you're a Blake Lively fan, you've actually got a pretty good chance of figuring this out the moment that Faith's body is pulled out of the lake. In the close-up of her dead face, it's clear that Emily's facial mole has actually moved to the other cheek, seemingly confirming that she isn't the real Emily. From there, the basic laws of deduction make it pretty easy to guess that Emily had a twin, rather than one of the 2 main cast members making a shockingly premature exit from the movie. Jason is an impostor. Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. So the Jason Voorhees depicted throughout the 5th Friday the 13th film is actually a copycat impostor, a deranged, bereaved father named Roy Burns, who adopts Jason's persona to enact revenge on those he deemed responsible for his son's death. But how do you spot this earlier? Well, there's an extremely obvious in retrospect but seemingly totally irrelevant clue that is presented to the unknowing viewer throughout the film. As here we can see that Jason's hockey mask is slightly different to the one that we know and love. Sorry, not love, fear. The chevrons are blue rather than red, which provides a slight clue that the killer that we're looking at isn't the real Jason. And while it's fair to say that the iconic Jason mask has had subtle changes throughout several prior films, after the copycat storyline had played out and the real Jason returned in the next movie, the filmmakers ensured to keep the design more consistent to assure audiences that they weren't going to be duped again.